Our next speaker is Christele Dedebant from France.
So I'm sorry it will sound a bit redundant, but I would like as well to thank Miguel Saitran and ASR in general for this beautiful conference, and I'm then very honored to be here. It really sounds like, Oscar celebration or something like that. Well, but I'm very happy to be here. I wrote my PhD as a student of history in Paris about, to say quickly, women's movement in Pakistan. I would like to apologize for two main points. First of all, my accent, and I'm not sure it will be understandable for everyone, so I will try to speak slowly. And second point, my paper is mainly concerned with, Muslim reformists and the Pakistani scene, and as such, it involves certain laws that might be not known to everyone here. On the other hand, I don't think I will tell anything new about women's movement that is not known to the Pakistani women as well. So it's a kind of trap. What I wanted to do here is to kill two birds with one stone. I know the expression is dreadful, but what I wanted to discuss first, it's the kind of historiography, feminist or not, that presents the Arabic era as a turning point, or even better, a total reversal in Pakistan politics. That kind of historiography that I will qualify as history as drama. On the other hand, I wanted to discuss that kind of discursive scheme that presents Zia's era as, let's say, natural, fatal outcome of the previous decades, what I call history as tragedy. In two cases, Islam, the discourse of Islam will work out as a major reference. Unfortunately, I don't have any other grand narrative to propose as an alternative, though I like to present women's movement in Pakistan as an epic. Let's see the end. But what I would like to point out here is the complexity of the dynamics at work, dynamics at work between Islam, the state, and women. In the Sharif society of pre-partition India, the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries was a milestone for a movement in favor of women's education. While the 20s and 30s, on the other hand, saw the growth of social legal claims. In women's organizations, both Muslims and Pan-Indians, themes as diverse as remarriage of widows, polygamy, inheritance, political suffrage, purdah, and child marriage were abundantly discussed at the very moment polarization of parties began. The raising of the minimum age requirement for marriage was achieved through the 1929 Child Marriage Restraint Act. Raised at the beginning of the 20th century by the reformist Said Mumtaz Ali, the issue of the prohibition of child marriage was overwhelmingly supported by the representatives of Muslim women's organizations, as well as Indian or Pan-Indians, of course, but I will limit myself to the Muslims. Among their male co-religionists, however, apprehensions toward this legal step were running high, largely due to the claim for an autonomous family law. Being initially among the opponents of the law, on the grounds that the 1929 Child Restraint Marriage Act was relevant only to the Hindu communities, Muhammad Ali Jinnah sided eventually with the legislator, strongly rejecting the objections of the ulama. The future Qaidi Azam declared, if we are going to allow ourselves to be influenced by the public opinion that can be created in the name of religion, when we know that religion has nothing whatever to do with the matter, I think we must have the courage to say, no, we are not going to be frightened by that. Adamant as he seems to be, Jinnah would later turn to the ulama more than once. One of the examples was the 1937 Sharia Application Act defended by Jinnah himself. The aim of this act was, theoretically at least, meant to end the dual system, customary and Islamic, which regulated the personal status of Indian Muslims. Here, one needs to bear in mind the fact that Jinnah deplored the collision of the political and the religious during the time of the Khilafat movement in the 20s, and the fact that he was not over-enthusiastic over the defense of the Shariat itself. For the future Qaidi Azam, the Muslim community, far from being defined by Islamic law, represented above all a political force. Yet, following the formula of Gay Mino, a twist and a take on the famous feminist motto, the personal is political, during the 30s and 40s, the intensification of communitarianism and party politics actually made the Muslim personal status highly political. The identification of the Shariat as the very symbol of Islam at the hands of the ulama led a number of secular leaders to use its emblematic power. Parallelly, the champions of the women's cause at the time had largely subscribed to the principle of the enforcement of certain aspects of the Islamic law. For, as far as women's rights were concerned, certain sections of the Shariat appeared very promising. Customary laws actually deprived Muslim women of their inheritance and entitlements, which otherwise would have been guaranteed by both Shia and Sunni laws. Traditionally, a large majority of Muslim women were, and still are, supposed to forego their share in favor of their male relatives. Hence, the protests raised in the 30s by the landowning class, particularly here in Punjab, against the 1937 Shariat Act, which threatened to abolish the colonial customary practices. Jinnah at this time was not willing to alienate the Punjabi landed gentry. Consequently, the Shariat Act he was defending was passed, but not with huge compromises being made. As a matter of fact, the 1937 Shariat Act, as it finally appeared, was silent on the crucial question of women's inheritance of land. The question, however, re-emerged in 1948 in the wake of the formation of Pakistan. Against the maneuvering of the parliament, both ulama and women activists pleaded for the enforcement and the extension of the 1977 Act. A procession of women Muslim leaders, accompanied shoulder to shoulder by sympathizers of Islamic circle, actually made a demonstration in front of the Punjab Assembly. Promulgated in 1948, the West Punjab Muslim Personal Law eventually formally allowed women to inherit land. Needless to say, the law was never, and still is, more theoretic than effective. As far as women's rights were concerned, the net result of the 1937 Shariat Act was indeed meager, but it boosted Jinnah's credibility. Based as it was on the hypothesis that the Muslim as a whole unanimously had adhered to the Islamic codified laws, the legal text conferred upon its defender the sort of legitimacy that Jinnah needed as a spokesman of a putative community. The family law, locus of political and ideological investment, did not lose its value as symbolic capital for altogether the ulama, the Islamists, the modernists, and even the secularists. 2 years after the 1937 Sharia Application Act, the 1939 Muslim Dissolution of Marriages Act further reinforced this trend. The historical context of this new law went along with the differentialist logic, even if not yet separatist, consolidated during the 30s and 40s. It involved two well-known personalities, Iqbal, the spiritual father of Pakistan, and Maulana Ashraf Ali Tanavi, the prolific author of the voluminous Bihishti Ziva, and one of the few Deobandis who would later side with the Muslim League. The origin of the 1939 Muslim Dissolution of Marriages Act put forward less the question of divorce per se, but more the crucial issue of apostasy. The circumstances that shape the law are as follows. By the beginning of the 20th century, the number of Muslim women opting to leave their religion in order to escape from the hazards of their marriage was apparently increasing, or at least was perceived as such. This was due to the inherent restriction imposed on Muslim women by Hanafi law in the area of divorce. In order to contain the forces of disorder and to keep the flock together, Iqbal called for a reform of the law. Maulana Ashraf Ali Tanavi, who incidentally had issued earlier a fatwa annulling all marriages where one of the spouses was known to be an apostate, decided in the 30s to withdraw his previous judgment and became the mastermind behind the reform. The 1939 Act that was finally agreed upon introduced three important reforms in Muslim personal law. Firstly, it validated Muslim marriages even when the wife was known to be an apostate. Secondly, it provided Muslim women with the right to initiate divorce proceedings on specific grounds defined by the canons of Malikite school, such as cruelty, insanity, abandonment, etc. And thirdly, it allowed women to initiate divorce on the grounds of puberty. Supported by the Deobandis ulama and applauded by the modernists and the secularists, the 1939 Act consecrated the alliance between the different forces of the socio-religious reform. Thus, as it was, the 1937 Sharia Application Act and the 1939 Muslim Dissolution of Marriages Act had then traced the contours of a virtual or imagined Ummah and had sketched the silhouette of an abstract Muslim who could not be defined by any sect, mazhab, or school of thought. Once again here, the champions of women's cause at the time overwhelmingly subscribed to this political artifact, for they believed that it could help to eradicate customs and practices deemed to be repugnant. Islam, or rather the codification of certain aspects of the Islamic law in family matter, were then seen as an opening towards social legal advancement. Besides that, the political gain was considerable. As Gamino pointed out, Jinnah earned his first success by capitalizing on the symbolic force of the Muslim family law and on the partial rapprochement with the ulama. His famous slogan, Islam in danger, which must be noted was not generally taken up by the ulama, later underlined the polarization of communities. After he assumed power, however, the secularists, Qaidi Azam, attempted to disentangle the suffocating wounds of communalism. His memorable speech, "You may belong to any religion, caste or creed, etc., has become the motto of the contemporary progressives of Pakistan. At this stage, I will not touch upon the first decade of Pakistan, but will directly evoked the first coup d'etat headed by Ayub Khan in 1958. The general has gone down in history as the dictator who promoted what is generally perceived as modernist Islam. Ayub Khan's era was peculiar in the sense that while the dictator in power was advocating a rather liberal credo as far as Islam is concerned, not for the leftists, of course, some of the conservative representatives of the so-called scripturalist school of thought, including Maududi, the founder of Jamaat Islami, attempted to picture themselves as the champions of suppressed democracy. It was within this very specific ideological context that the Muslim Family Law Ordinance saw the light of the day. By then, the personal was more than ever political. The genesis of what is seen today as one of the most liberal laws pertaining to women in Pakistan, despite its shortcoming, is as follows. In 1955, All Pakistan Women Association, better known under the name APWA, and some other women's organizations founded just after the partition, had violently protesting against the then Prime Minister Muhammad Ali Bogra's decision to take a second wife. This women's front against polygamy reappropriated the classical argument of the Muslim modernists. The current state that the principle of equity in relation of wives should come before all else. And in cases where these conditions cannot be met, which is always the case, then a monogamous marriage is the only option. The Prophet of Islam, of course, being an exception to the rule, apparently. This reasoning via negativa, abundantly commented by one of the leaders of the progressives, Fazlur Rahman, had been previously developed by the contemporary of Syed Ahmad Khan, Amir Ali, as well as by the Salafiyya thinkers. Thus, consolidated by this theoretical precedent, the 1955 Women's Front obtained the formation of the so-called Rashid Commission. The report of this commission is supposed to highlight certain proposals for women's rights, particularly in the area of polygamy and divorce, came out 1 year later in 1956. At this time, there were enough controversial points to slow down the process of implementation of the proposals. Maududi, for instance, condemned what he saw as inconsistencies in the attempt at banning or even restricting polygamy. He argued that such restriction would open the way to extramarital liaisons, in which case the status of the other women or the other woman, the mistress, would never equate the rank of the first and only wife. Then it was prejudicial to women in general. In the matter of divorce, the stand of the opponents of the Rashid Commission was hardly less firm. Firstly, as they argued, men should not be deprived of their discretionary right to repudiate their spouse. And secondly, these private matters should not be brought before a public tribunal, as the Rashid Commission recommended it, but should remain under the monopoly of the Qazi. For the Commission report intended to limit the jurisdiction of traditional Islamic legal experts in favor of state-appointed lawyers. It's important to know that at this very moment, the state was attempting to force a breach into the family law, which was the bastion of the Islamic legal establishment. So strong were the resistance put up by the defenders of the so-called Islamic personal law that the modernists and the secularists were forced to bide their time until the arrival of a non-democratic regime before they could achieve, at least partially, their goal. General Ayub Khan, a fierce anti-leftist, but as well a known boy of Aligarh College, a close associate of the modernist Fazlur Rahman, a personal friend of Begum Rana Liaquat Ali Khan, and a generous patron of to All Pakistan Women Association, AQA, was indeed very well disposed toward the advocates of women's condition, as long as, of course, no woman would stand in the way of his own ambitions. For, as we all know here, the modernist and women-friendly dictator ordered the ulama to issue fatwas against the candidature of Fatima Jinnah prior the 1965 presidential elections. Ultimately, however, the 1961 Muslim Family Ordinance, based upon the Rashid Commission, was pushed through under the direction of Ayub Khan himself, while its opponents were authoritatively reduced to silence. In defense of the 1961 ordinance, which both sought to restrict and not ban polygamy and regulate divorce proceedings, the general solemnly stated that Islam, being dynamic and progressive, promoted peace and justice in all aspects of existence. In the same spirit, the women advocates of the Muslim Family Ordinance, I here refer overall to the AQA activists, far from rejecting the Islamic card, never ceased to promote what they labeled the liberal face of the religion. Now, in my opinion, even if the adversaries of the Muslim Family Ordinance, including Maududi, saw in this claim a mere rhetorical expedient, the stand of the apologists of the 60s appeared to be a continuation of an intellectual tradition that dates back to the well-known Aliyah movement in the end of the 19th century. At this time, it has to be remembered the socio-religious reformist or literati had successfully combined the modernist precepts of theological renaissance with the moral principles of social-legal advancements. Thus, in my opinion again, even if playing the religious card had served the interests of the champions of Muslim Family Ordinance, it would not have been enough to label it as a mere discursive tactic or as a mere demonstration of subservience. Rather, one could see in it an exemplary case, a cas d'école, as we will say in French, of convergence between a certain fringe of civil society, even if the word was not used at this time, I mean AQA and other women's lobbies, and the regime in power, Ayub Khan and his peers. Belonging more or less to the same strata of the liberal elite, the representatives of power and their epigones publicly subscribed at this time to a certain set of common values. Next to this entente de classe, certain spokesmen of the Islamic camps were still persona non grata. As a matter of fact, during Ayub Khan's era, Jamaati people were confined to jail almost as often as the leftists. But this persona non grata, I here refer to the Islamists, would be allowed entry into the democratic space by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Yet, just like his ex-mentor Ayub Khan, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto proved his goodwill towards certain aspect of women's cause. By virtue of the 1933 Constitution, the state was officially the guardian of equality before the law by formally prohibiting all forms of sexual discrimination. Women, among other things, became eligible to join the superior civil service. Yet, the third constitution of Pakistan had received the tacit assent of one of the most vociferous opponents of Ayub Khan, Maududi himself. Maududi in early 70s, Maududi's support in early 70s was understandable for the reason that the constitution had declared Islam as the religion of the state, had imposed the preservation of religious ethos by prohibiting prostitution, drugs, obscenity, etc., and above all, had laid down the official definition of a proper Muslim, which will serve as the basis for the excommunication of the Ahmadis in 1974. Furthermore, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto had systematically purged his ex-allies from the radical left with the express support of none other than Maududi. In return for these efforts of purification, above all in the campus, Maududi gave his tacit endorsement to the Constitution. Here, one has to bear in mind that the generation of women's activists who will later be a part of the Women Action Forum were often directly or indirectly linked to the leftist movement in the 70s and, as such, closely witnessed the regime's harassment. Admittedly, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's In People's Memory benefited largely from his successor in famous image and personality. But a seasonable section of the left does remember the moves of the self-proclaimed Qaid Irwan. This point seems to me very important as it highlights the profile of the current women's activists in Pakistan, whose stand and trajectory are fairly different from the representatives of the more traditional APWA. Back to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, despite all these vain moves and concessions made in favor of the religious lobbies, the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan appeared to be, I quote here Rashida Patil, theocratic in theory, but secular in practice. A conclusion that the Islamist camp eventually shared, to say the least. From 1977, the military Islamic dictatorship of Ziaullah had then reinforced rather than introduced the Islamic theory of the previous government by inscribing its reform program into a legislative framework and by focusing on women and minorities. However, far from competing with the holistic example of neighboring Iran, the Islamic model that was promoted by Zia was neither free of certain political considerations and precautions. I will here set aside the infamous and abhorrent Hudud Ordinance of 1979, which, as we all know, defined fornication as a crime against God and then by extension against the state, and among other things, blurred the distinction between rape and adultery. I would rather evoke two legal projects, namely the Qisas in Dayat and the Kanon in Shahadat, which demonstrate how political Zia's Islamization program could be at time when he wanted to let the steam out, as Hina Jilani beautifully put it. Against both of the laws, the constant opposition of the Women's Action Forum, formed in 1981, is clearly tangible. We speak here about this generation of women's activists who loosely or firmly adhered to the left during the 70s, were the vanguard of the struggle for democracy in the 80s, and are here in front of me right now. As a matter of fact, the careful examination of these two laws envisaged and modified during Zia's decade reflect the dynamism of the feminine opposition front, as well as it demonstrates the tactical efforts of the legislator and behind him, Zia himself. The Qisas and Diyat, taken of blood money, originally stipulated that the compensation for the involuntary homicide of a woman should be half the amount that was due in cases where the victim was a man. In early 80s, denouncing in the same books, I wrote the abhorrent concept of the price of a human life and the abject principle of inequality of the sexes before the law. The Women Action Forum was instrumental, if not entirely responsible, for the freezing of the law for one decade. In 1990, ultimately, the infamous Dissolution was promulgated through a presidential ordinance without the discriminatory clause pertaining to women. A quasi-similar fate was in store for the highly contested Kanon in Shahadat, or Law of Evidence, which in its first version in 1982 prescribed that, with the exception of crimes pertaining to Hudud laws, 2 Muslim males, or by default 1 male and 2 female witnesses, were required in order to attest a crime. After a barrage of petition, press conference, nationally and internationally, pickets and other demonstrations orchestrated by women's fronts, which stand at the climax of women's movement epics in Pakistan, Ziaullah's administration was forced, if not to retreat, at least to water down his ostentatious claims of Islamization. 4. Do I speak too fast? No? And despite the opposite claims of the regime, the Canon Shahadat, ultimately promulgated in 1984, has brought only minor modification to the Colonial Evidence Act of 1872. With the exception of the crimes pertaining to voodoo law, the delegation of women's testimony actually limited itself to the financial transactions. A seemingly futile precaution indeed, considering the fact that the banking system in Pakistan already had it as a norm to have multiple co-signatories. To sum it up, and I'm soon reaching my conclusion, it's ironic that the Qisas in Dayat and Canon Shahadat have simultaneously marked the victory of both Women Action Forum and the Zia's administration. If the Women's Front could legitimately congratulate itself for the watering down of the two laws, Zia's administration could publicly honor itself for the application of the celebrated Nizam-i-Mustafa, Order of the Prophet. Interesting enough, while Zia remained silent about the extent to which he had compromised, Women Action Forum, for obvious reasons, never relented its firm and constant confrontational stand to the regime and acknowledged these legal concessions only mezzo voce, in soft voice. For obvious reasons again, the women's rights activists in Pakistan hardly put forward the actual complexity of the application of hudud laws, namely the technical distinction between tadzir and had, for example, and the actual non-practice of stoning to death, etc. For, of course, beyond the aberrant and terrible consequences of the hudud laws for society at large, and women in particular, women's rights activists firmly stood, and still do, at least I assume so, against the very principle of a so-called Islamic penal system. To put it in black and white, and this is my conclusion, if modernist Islam, or perceived as such, was welcomed by the 60s women's activists as a step forward in the sphere of personal law through the family ordinance, scripturalist conservative Islam, or presented as such, was denounced by the 80s women's activists as a retrogressive step backward in the sphere of the criminal law. The famous book of Farid al-Shahid and Hawa Mumtaz, Women of Pakistan, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, give the tune to this kind of political choreography invariably led by the religious idiom. To trace the symmetry further between the 60s and the 80s in the span of 2 decades, where the modernists of secular women's activists took their distance with Zia's regime right from the beginning, the feminine section of the Jamaat Islami gained in entry to the higher echelons of the state. By the 80s, Jamaati women had at their disposal important financial latitude for organizing conferences, etc., etc. An exchange of pleasantry between women and the state that was reminiscent of the entente cordiale between Apwa and Ayubra in the 60s, Apwa, Shirkat Gat, and Begum Nusrat Bhutto in 1975. For sure, as stated earlier, the new generation of women activists standing against Zia was fairly different from the previous generation of the liberal conservative Apwain. As a matter of fact, the 80s marked the unprecedented collision or confrontation between a wave of women activists, which label itself till today left to left of center, whatever it means, and a dictatorial regime that pretended to promote a trend of orthodox or neo-orthodox Islam, whatever it means. A major clash between women in the state was then bound to happen. The point I would like to underline here is that the use of Islam does not appear as the prime element of breakup. It's not the use or the abuse of Islam per se. And as a matter of fact, Islam, during the reform movement in the 90s, the movement for Pakistan, Ayub Khan and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's era, had always occupied a major discursive space in pre- and post-partition. The ulema and the Islamists used it, of course, but so did the modernists and even the secularists. Admittedly, modernist Islam has been a convenient screen that could conceal numerous divergent voices, including the secularists, as well as, shall I say the big word, the atheists. It could have been a mere tactic, of course, at times, but it could have been a genuine tool of representation as well. And at times, of course, it opened ways for women's rights, at least from the 30s to the 60s. What provoked the breakup between the state and the women's movement was certainly not the use of Islam for political expediency that was not new at all. Even not entirely the freezing of the democratic contract that was not equally new. That was rather what I will qualify as a discursive shift, discourse, of course, informing the reality. The Islamic ideology that was shared by both the power in place and women's activists up to the 70s suddenly became lettre morte, out of date in the 80s. In other words, the rhetoric changed as well as the reality that comes with, of course. Here, I would like to discuss forward with the main argument of Ayesha Jalala's brilliant analysis in the Convenience of Subservience, published in early 90s. In her paper, she stated that the early women activists always played the Islamic card for tactical reasons, mainly because they were the main beneficiaries of the status quo and because they feared to jeopardize their position in the social and political spectrum. Then, as it can be foreseen as posteriori, they fell in their own discursive and tactical trap with the advent of military Islamic dictatorship. This demonstration, however relevant it might be, seems to be slightly too instrumentalist, sorry for the jargon. Like it or not, the Islamic lexicon, whatever it was, has been a passage obligé since the very idea of Pakistan, and discourse is performative. Women's rights activists did not secure any monopoly of it. And one cannot simply assume that the modernist repertoire, dynamic and progressive Islam, or Islamic socialism was not genuinely used at time and reproduced by the actresses themselves. Now, it's far more too complex an issue to decide whether the use and the abuse of this seemingly mild rhetoric prepared the path for a far more loaded Islamic or Islamist discourse, as it's often said, in European analysis of Pakistan. The hypothesis is too lately evolutionist to be entirely politically relevant. Did Ayub Khan and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto prepare the way for Zia? That cannot be lumped as that. Continuity or reversal? Tragedy or drama? At least I cannot say. Yet, one fact seems to be indisputable. Zia's profile and language marked a rupture in the long line of leaders, democratic or not, who more or less belong to the same liberal strata of the society. The change of the Islamic ideology then reflects as well the shift of the political leadership. With this precision, nevertheless, when the old leadership profile can be restored, as it was, as a matter of fact, with the two tenors of Benazir Bhutto, the new Islamic ideology has proven to be much harder to repeal, and that is what is front of the women's activists today.